Hello, everyone. My name is Kristin Snowden. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California. And these are monthly live webinars that I do talking about all things relationships and I guess personal development as well. I try to provide you all the education, research, tools that we just never learn in school, how to do relationships, how to manage high crisis conflict, uncovering addictions and other mind-blowing things within our family system or our loved ones. I specialize in betrayal trauma and how to navigate that. So this is a webinar talking about all of those things. And today we're going to focus in on the four most common stress responses that we have to trauma, to threats, to whatever is unpredictable. So this will be a discussion on the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn stress responses, but spending extra time talking about the fawn, or as we also call it, the please and appease trauma stress response. Because as many of the people who are attending this webinar are in a heightened state of stress, whether it's because in their microcosm world of their relationships, their significant other, a lot of these people are betrayed partners or in recovery from addiction and other multi-leveled complexities and conflicts and struggles. In a macro world, we're dealing with long-term stress from pandemics, lots of unpredictability, lots of threat, lots of concern. So sometimes we feel like our world and our environment and our body is controlling us rather than our best thinking and our rational thought and our values and goals of knowing how we want to show up as a human, how we want to show up with our loved ones, etc. And as I always say, education is the empowerment tool, right? The more I can help you understand what is happening neurobiologically within your mind, body, your wiring, your hormones, your chemistry, the more you can take steps to undo what is no longer working for you or better understand why things are happening within your own life or your engagement with others. So without further ado, let's talk about the fawn or appease and please trauma response. So let's first talk about what is trauma. I want you to expand your understanding of the word trauma. I think we like to think about punching, kicking, violence, someone being held at gunpoint, where the threat is extremely obvious that, death is possible and peril is overwhelming. But you have to understand your brain is lazy. So your brain, in an effort of keeping you alive, will interpret many things as potentially life-threatening. It'd rather just kind of put a general swath over everything. Like I use the example sometimes, those Newfoundland, big, puffy, white, they're like St. Bernard dogs, but they're gigantic and they're black. And there's been some times where I'll look at one far away and it'll look like a bear. Because my brain is not wired to be accurate. It is wired to be efficient in keeping me alive. My prefrontal cortex, which takes a lot more blood flow, a lot more oxygen, is wired to be more accurate. But that back brain that comes on a lot faster than this part of my brain is wired to just very generally tell me this is a potential threat. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So take a minute to expand as you're exploring, okay, what are my potential stressors and struggles in life right now? Hopefully I can help you expand that. So a traumatic event or a stressful experience is loosely based on one main thing. Your nervous system gets overwhelmed. So it gets feedback from this world. If you think of your body as kind of an enclosed nervous system, it's these cells and atoms that are kind of bumping into other humans and other things in this world. And it's kind of responding to what you're seeing and what you're experiencing and what you're hearing and what you're feeling. And it's a feedback loop system. It is basically any time you experience trauma and stress or struggle and strife, anytime it is shocked, that nervous system. We move along life in a predictable manner, or we try to. We like comfort, we like predictability. That equals safety to us. That allows us to kind of move along in our high executive functioning space. But anything that overwhelms your nervous system is initially experienced as trauma and stress. Anything that catches you off guard. So anything that's unpredictable. You thought something was supposed to be this way. You thought you knew this about this person. You thought you were supposed to drive to work without any incident, and suddenly it went wrong. It is something you don't feel prepared for or know how to handle. And it can make you feel scared or helpless or confused. Confusion's a more accessible word sometimes. It can lead you to feel shameful and more disconnected from the world. So this is what's setting me apart from everybody. This is what's making me different. This is why I'm not valuable. This is evidence of how much someone doesn't love me, or how I can trust people who lie to me and harm me, right? That's all the shame and disconnection experience. You experience moments when you're not sure that you're going to make it through the event. There's this word about loss of context and time. So there's this moment, like such as, again, this pandemic, it helps explain trauma so much easier now. It's more accessible to everybody. But this overwhelming idea of like a helplessness and a lack of control, that's partly why it's traumatic. But another thing is like, when will this end? You know, this, when will I go through a 24-hour period without crying or being stressed about this particular incident in my life? Or going back to the pandemic, when will I go 24 hours without talking about the pandemic, thinking about it, being impacted by it? That lack of context of what's happening at me, to me, how much longer do I have to endure, that creates a long-term stress response. And then there's this other concept. So that's a singular traumatic event, right? That can just happen in a singular time, a car accident, a scary moment. But then there's this idea of complex trauma. So if I grew up in a family system where there was lots of unpredictability, I didn't know when there was going to be an emotional explosion, or there's addiction, or mental health instability, or financial insecurity, or I lived in a community where there was a lot of unpredictable, scary things that occurred, that can create complex trauma. And this is important for you to understand. Your body wires around your experiences and creates adaptive responses for how to continue on in life despite this trauma from recurring, right? How to survive it. So remember that as I talk about the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, because above all else, none of this is supposed to be shaming, right? How you show up in these moments of high conflict, stress, and struggle. Understanding your autonomic nervous survival responses, your innate default settings, they're just highly adaptive ways that you learned how to survive, right? You have 100% evidence to this day, to this moment, that you can make it through the day. And part of the reason why is because you've used, one of these four or all of these four responses in the state of unpredictability, stress, and struggle. So this is just meant to be educational, not blaming or shaming. Let's talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response. I like using this metaphor. So this is a background on Peter Levine, is someone who's done a lot of research on animals, of how they've responded to, my light just went out. More unpredictability. Now I'm in the dark. So they studied animals and just understanding the way that they respond to stress, right? And see if they could correlate it to humans. And so let me use an example of a seal happily, going about in seaweed and then senses danger. So let's start with, first, a animal senses that there's a threat. So again, remember that wide swath general application of maybe they saw a shadow, maybe they saw something move. So the seal's bobbing about in the seaweed and it hears, or maybe it hears other seals running away, right? Because don't forget, we're meant to pick up other people's states, right? Or other animals' states of panic, because that might give us a cue that something's wrong and something's bad and I need to act, right? So the seal picks up that something's not right. And suddenly they get a flow of like, pay attention, move to your sympathetic nervous system, start figuring out how you need to respond to this threat. You need to assess further. Then when they do some quick, really back of your brain millisecond assessment and find out, yes, there is a shark coming at me. It's a threat. I need to respond in fight, flight, freeze. And then we'll talk about the fawn. But unless you're a social animal, you usually don't respond with a fawn. So if there is anger or frustration, well, we'll talk about that in a second. Let's first talk about animals. So a seal is not going to be able to talk their way out of getting eaten. They're not going to be able to fight their way out of getting eaten. And if they freeze, they will absolutely be eaten. So the only option in that exact millisecond moment is flight. So they are flooded with a bunch of chemicals and hormones that will help them move quickly and run away. When the body system is overloaded with that rapid heart rate, lack of oxygen, the body starts releasing natural opiates. So if you guys are familiar with the opioid addiction, it is a pain blocker. And we actually have natural pain blockers that are called opiates. And they exist naturally in our body. And believe it or not, if you watch like a National Geographic, when you watch the lion kind of run after the gazelle and finally catch it, you notice that the gazelle will tend to go limp. And that's because it is being flooded with opiates, either preparing it for death or just because the oxygen and the heart rate has gone too long, too far, and it can't run anymore. And so you'll kind of notice it almost die without it actually dying. Now, if by some chance that animal is able to escape death, like in the National Geographic, I saw two hyenas or somebody start fighting with each other, and it distracted them from getting at the animal. And it went from this complete dead state to just all of a sudden hopping back alive and dashing out again, because it perceived that it had a chance to fly away or to flight one more time, and it got away. So if that happens, once it gets into its safe state, it actually starts convulsing and shaking off what just happened. Like literally, like when a dog shakes off the water on their body, and it helps release the chemicals and the hormones of that fight, flight, freeze state that it was flooded with. And then it carries on in life, kind of joins the herd again, goes back to the seaweed and joins his seal friends. So meaning that there's a kind of beginning, middle, and end state for wild animals. Unfortunately, and fortunately, since we are social creatures, the engagement of other human beings, so not just this obvious predator of this greater apex predator is the obvious threat that we need to avoid. Because we're such social creatures, just even loving somebody and in being in relationship with somebody can be a potential threat to us. So let's talk about the four responses that we might experience depending on our experience with other people. So if we perceive an experience, because by the way, it's all about perception. It's not about what reality is. It's based how I perceive the tone of voice, the perceived attacker, the perceived attack, the perceived conflict, the perceived environment, how they're viewing me. That is all cues that my brain takes in. So if I experience it in anger and frustration, I will probably fight, right? So if I perceive that I can assert any kind of power over in the situation, or I have a fighting chance, I'm a fight. If I'm in a state of terror or alarm and a severe threat, and I'm not going to be able to fight, I will fly. I will get out, flight. If I perceive it in a state of like despair, desperation, I've checked all the exits, there's no way out, I'm stuck here, high anxiety, just sheer exhaustion of, my nervous system being just completely exhausted, I'm going to move into freeze state. Another word for that is we talk about dissociation. So sometimes you'll hear about that where it's just a numb out state. I feel nothing, I think nothing, I process nothing. I'm dissociated. And then the last one that we've really only been talking about for recent years is what we call the fawn state. So the please and appease state, where it is solely social animals that will even bother doing this. Because let me tell you, the please, appease, fawn responses come from highly social adaptive skills. So you will only see it in maybe humans where we're highly adaptable, or you can see it sometimes like in dog behavior with like where you go to the dog park and a new dog, a big one comes out, another one, and they kind of fawn and like say, hey, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you, I'm not going to bite you. And they'll fawn because they are also social creatures, or they'll fawn with humans depending on the situation. So the please, appease, or fawn response is a highly skillful neurobiological survival mechanism where we've assessed the engagement going on with the person who's considered the aggressor, the perpetrator, the person who's maybe the one leading the high conflict experience. They're the ones who are bringing on the stressful event, or someone who has the power over that person. They will assess that situation and respond to it with providing cues of, hey, I'm on your team. Hey, whatever you want, whatever you need, whatever I need to say to avoid conflict entirely, shut it down, pretend everybody's fine and happy. And like, I'm the trustworthy one, I'm your teammate. But the issue is that it's done in a more manipulative way, right? Because what you're doing is you're subverting and pushing down your own feelings and opinions and experiences to kind of just de-escalate the situation, please and appease that person, or avoid the stress of the conflict in general. And we're going to be talking about that because remember, not all conflict is bad, especially in a long-term relationship. Sometimes we need that space to talk about uncomfortable things and things that you're not okay with, or resentment that builds up, etc. But we'll talk about that in a moment. So please, appease, and fawn responses are the act of trying to connect with that perpetrator, aggressor, however you want to state that person creating the stress in your body. Trying to connect with them and please them, kind of make them happy, but it's in an inauthentic, ingenuine way. So the goal, remember, if you've watched my videos long enough, the goal is always to be fully integrated, right? If we fast forward to the end of the story of lots of hard work and personal growth and relational growth, the goal is to be your good, bad, light, dark, and get to show up in your intimate relationships and talk about hard things, celebrate great things, struggle with each other, but love each other in spite of our flaws, kind of walk into the sunset together as perfectly imperfect humans. So the reason why the appease and appease stress response might not work for you in most situations is because you're subverting your real experience. You're pushing down cues of, oh, this isn't uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable. This isn't working for me. I'm not okay with this. And you continue to push it down. And there's a lot of people who this started in their childhood, and they learned often to appease and please because maybe mom would explode so much that they'd be the funny, sarcastic kid to kind of distract the family system, or they were just always the one that never had needs because there was enough people in the family system who had plenty of needs. So I'm going to be the one who needs nothing, never shares my feelings, never has anything other than good news to bring to everybody. And they pretend to be happy and okay in order with the hope of connecting with humans, but in a manipulative way of trying to not have anything bad happen. try not to have conflict come upon me and have to deal with the discomfort of that. So here's a few things. If anyone has ever heard of Stockholm syndrome, when I was doing some research on this, I thought it was interesting. People were saying that Stockholm syndrome can sometimes be better explained by that please, appease, fawn response. So if you remember, it's if you've been kidnapped or a perpetrator has kind of like taken you on as a hostage situation, there'll be people who kind of start aligning themselves with the perpetrator, and they call that Stockholm syndrome. But they said, really, it's actually a highly adaptive, skillful technique that they used to survive that experience, because they learned to say, hey, I'm not going to run away. Yeah, like, sure, I align with you, whatever you say, because the calmer they can keep the perpetrator, by saying, no, you don't need to kill me. You can trust me. I'm your teammate. You can really appreciate how highly adaptive and skillful that is. The other thing I want to add in is, as I was doing more research on this, it was pointing out too that there's this stigma that we have culturally about being a fake person. I think Freud called the defense mechanism sublimation. When you really don't like somebody and you're like, oh my God, hi, how are you? And then you're just like, oh God, I hate that person. But really, that is a version of that fawn, please, appease kind of state, that you don't feel safe with that person. And it certainly doesn't feel safe for you to have an engagement with them and say, look, we had a really uncomfortable situation. Let's have a hard conversation about it. Let's even get to the other side. If that's not accessible because that person does not have emotional competency, they've not shown themselves to be safe and have hard conversations and survive it without using mean words or, exploiting you or your vulnerabilities, then you are safer to be using that adaptive skill of just pleasing and appeasing, moving on. So I'm really trying to help you reframe some of these concepts around the skills, the social skills that you use to survive. One of the common things that I see in betrayed partners is kind of post uncovering the addiction. That, of course, is the time where we start, okay, now that I've had all the information that I've been denied because my partner's been living a double life, we start reflecting, all right, what was going on? What did I miss? Or what should I see? Or you have a new lens, right? Like I said, crisis kind of is like a sift and it makes everything fall to the side. And at that point, what's left is you're just assessing your family, your relationships, trying to figure out, how did it all go wrong? What happened? How can I set my life up with boundaries and safety and a better understanding so I can survive in the future? And so looking at these moments, these exchanges with your partner are just an understandable step when you're trying to heal. And so one of my clients was talking about an example of her please and appease was that she was sitting at a dinner table, and though she didn't know her husband was acting out sexually, that was a whole hidden double life, it would manifest in their family system as just not rage, but he would just sit down at the dinner table and just start nitpicking at the kids, and just start going at them, right? So kind of that addictive behavior where I'm not talking about the fact that, oh, I feel shameful and regretful of all the nefarious behaviors that I've been doing behind your back, and I feel yucky inside, and I'm going to be honest and transparent and process it in a healthy way. All those yucky feelings come out, and why'd you get an F on the test? Or why are you chewing with your mouth open? Or why are you always late? Or things like that, because that's the way he's showing up in the relationships. So she became very hyper vigilant of reading his body language and knowing, right? Because in her socially adaptive skill set to maintain peace and keep her kids safe, she learned to pick up those cues and just either start doing alignment or kind of throwing in funny jokes to minimize the conflict and adversity that could have erupted at the dinner table. So it's really important for you to explore that, because let me say, and I'll close this up right now, is that therapists might do more harm when they're doing couples therapy and they don't really appreciate these fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses as highly adaptive skills. You adopted them for a reason. They worked at some point for you. And so it can do more damage if you go into couples therapy and they just said, oh, well, you just need to assert yourself. You just need to say, hey, I'm not okay with you talking to the kids like that. You need to do X, Y, and Z, right? We need to first better understand the relationship dynamic. How do you talk about hard things? How do you disagree? Or most importantly, how do you repair? Is there any repair within that relationship dynamic where you can assert yourself, right? You can say your opinion or feelings or how something can be handled better or things that you resent. There's a long, long buildup to the place where you can actually assert yourself. So just be careful of that, right? The opposite response to fawn and appeasing and pleasing is not all of a sudden like, this is how I feel and I won't accept anything less than this and these are my boundaries, because obviously it worked at some point and you really need to actually unwind and better, do like a relationship dialysis of how that served your relationship dynamic and how you can slowly pull it apart and come up with better ways. So let's talk about some things to start asking yourself as a closing, as you think about this fawn, please, appease response and how it shows up maybe in your life. Do you tend to smile or kind of act like nothing's wrong, or find yourself be very hypervigilant when there's any kind of conflict or inappropriate comments that occur within any relationship? How long back can you remember responding this way, kind of with this like, I need to pretend everything's okay. Okay, how can I make this comment to pull us out of this? Or how can I recover for this whole family system or this relationship system and make everyone happy again, or get out of this conflict? And specifically, who do you do this with? Right? Again, usually it's someone with an uneven power dynamic where there's a power over. So was it with like just your father, or was it with someone that you like a very sensitive friend that you had to kind of help her or him feel more safe or comfortable, or one of your children, right? Like start thinking about that. Is there a particular person that you do approach with this hypervigilant of, uh-oh, they're angry or upset or not doing well? How, what kind of clown suit do I need to put on to do the fun jig and get them in a happier state? Like it feels like a hypervigilance when you think about this, like you're really picking up on cues and tone of voice, and you're thinking about, instead of being like, what's going on with them? Why are they, right? Instead of looking at them like a feedback loop of why are they so unsafe? Why are they so angry? What's going on here? And kind of check in there. You're thinking of, okay, what kind of strategies can I use to bring joy and happiness and pleasure and appeasing? Like that's what your thought process is instead. Can you think back to the last time you felt this way? So when you if you take this back to your therapist's office, think if you can think back to a scenario where you felt this way. Like you knew you were going to an event where you were going to run into someone where you didn't feel safe with them, or, you've had conflict and you imagine yourself just moving to that pleasing and appeasing state, or maybe someone in your professional or personal life or hierarchy where they made an inappropriate comment or they're clearly disgruntled, and how you try to move in to do that pleasing, appeasing. So really just taking that scenario and seeing if you can kind of start pulling apart your feelings and your stories that you're telling yourself and how you can better show up more authentically, so to speak. The goal is to identify if and when this happens, this fawn response, explore the story that you're telling yourself around it, and how would you prefer to show up? Is this working for you? Because sometimes the answer is yes, it works. But sometimes it's not, right? In your primary relationship, usually it doesn't work. With the random woman that you run across at school that you just don't like, you might need to keep that fawn response. That's fine. And is it safe to move into a more authentic way, a more vulnerable way of sharing your thoughts and feelings rather than just pleasing and appeasing? So that is it for now, and let's open it up for questions.
This makes so much sense. as another coping mechanism. And fortunately, I can see how I've used that, in many different scenarios. Some, like you say, the random person that is just uncomfortable and, not worth engaging with. But even in my family system, I was like, oh yeah, like I was the person that deflected. Like I will deflect the energy. And I'm like, it's just fascinating to even consider. And you're talking about animals. And I was like, oh my God, my dog is we're running down the street and there's a noisy truck and he's, trying to, he's moving away, or, the other dog starts barking and then they join in together because now we've all been alerted that, it's danger, the Amazon truck might be coming, so, whatever it is, but, all of these, responses, my dog has great emotional intelligence. He is able to cue in, and he reacts to dogs. He's very much the chameleon. You want to play like this? Okay, I'll play like this. It's so like I had this great visual of like, oh, like, like that chameleon of like, I'm going to navigate this so my world is safe, maybe not being, well, he's a dog, but he's his authentic self all the time, probably, but still, to show up in those different ways, is a coping mechanism, but yeah, losing our authentic self. I thought it was really useful too, when you're talking about like just going to the absolute opposite right off the bat without exploring, how does this fabric all put together and what's going to be safe to move into a different way of communicating is really meaningful, because, an abrupt jarring, can be unsafe, for the entire system. So I think
you're
it's really
not going to be very good at it, right? If that's been your default setting. I always joke that when I was learning to assert myself, right, I swung over to the other end and I just became an extremely unpleasant person. Like I went from like, whatever you want to eat, wherever you want to go, to be like, no one tells me where I eat dinner. I'm the one, right? And it's like, it's a very slow response to like get to that middle spot.
Yeah. How do we navigate this? Being curious, the story I'm telling. I love when you share the story I'm telling myself, because, and you share too. It's like, it's not about reality. It's about perception. So it really is what we perceive the world to be in the moment, which can be completely opposite of what the reality is. But taking those few, taking the time to process and letting blood get to the front part of our brain, is difficult to do in the moment, especially if we're in, if we've gone to one of these spots. So questions. My husband, the addict, is extremely conflict avoidant, which results in fawning, very non-relational. Any recommendations for how to deal with this as a partner?
Well, for better or worse, the non-addict in the relationship usually has to be the more emotional intelligent. So sometimes it's more helpful, now that you have this education, is to kind of bring this up. Like it's and I try to do this with like my teenage kids too, that just also don't have the emotional intelligence yet to talk about, like they'll just be mean and not know that they're like stressed about something. So it's just a quiet suggestion, like, hey, I'm noticing I'm asking this question, and you don't seem to have an opinion. You don't seem to have any response, but I could imagine it's kind of a big deal. Like, I would think you would have a response to this. Is it like, I'm ready for it? But again, these are things, especially for an addict in recovery, like I said, there's so much to unravel about how this served your husband, this fawn response. There might be a lot, especially immediately after uncovering addiction. They're in a lot of states of shame, and sometimes, and they won't feel like they have the right to like an opinion. They won't feel like they have the right to share something, or they're just completely conflict avoidant because emotions are so high. But ironically, you kind of have to get through that and deal with the emotions and share what was going on. So usually it's suggested that in the novice stages of recovery, you have hard conversations with a therapist present, so they can help guide along someone who's more conflict avoidant, and kind of help them make kind of grow a better understanding of how they feel, that they're even having feelings, that they even have opinions. That's hard.
It is hard. And, and I think, and I'm not giving the betrayers a pass, but all, they have they're at zero with emotions and emotional intelligence and all of those type of things. But I think even having the conversation of, I have a vision for us being able to to relate on a different level. I know you're not there yet, but here's what I'd like to work towards, and how can we navigate this? How can we negotiate it as as a couple, can you show up, in some small way, like, and maybe be very specific. I'm hopeful that you could do this. Is that something you could do now? And we can work towards some of these bigger things, but just, giving the vision that, that there is, a possibility of, of a future, but I don't expect you to be there now, can also help. But I really agree with Kristin, like, you work with a professional for these, when it's too hard for the two of you to do it on your own, and it isn't like it isn't admitting defeat. It's going like, hey, we need a little help, and we want the best thing for our relationship. So how do we do this, that is supportive of each of us and the relationship?
Right.
Next question. I have some new contacts, so you see me squinting. Sorry. Can you give me a short script of what I can say when my 30-year-old daughter is giving off huge nonverbal cues of rage? I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I'm like, okay, you've been there, done that. Saying, you got teenagers, so saying something like, what I could do to help you or what I could do to help you right now seems to make it worse. Daughter is delightful, but a victim of an entire childhood of dealing with her SA father. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so glad you're asking that question too.
Yeah, I know. And this is where my therapist countertransference comes in, because I can jump into like a high conflict coupleship, and I'm like, oh, I know how to do this. We talk about daughter relating, as I have 2 teenage daughters that are in that emotional state, and I'm just like, I don't know anything, but let me try. So since this isn't related to me, again, I try to be their inner monologue that they might not even be aware of because they're in so much emotional turmoil. So my daughter's stressed about finals, so she's being very curt and saying things in ways that are not usually the way she says things. And so I will say, like, hey, do you think you're talking like this because you're really stressed about finals, or what's going on here? I kind of try to, because I'm in touch with the story I'm telling myself when I see it happen, right? So I see someone who normally isn't stressed or curt or unkind. I'm like, ooh, this isn't like her. These are the things that are going on. I wonder if X, Y, and Z is what's leading to this behavior. So I will kind of be the person that speaks up and says, hey, what's going on here? Either I'll say like, this reaction seems really strong. Do you think it's about more than just this? Or I'll see stiff body language and I'll say, oh, your body looks like it's really stressed right now. I don't know. You're picking up huge nonverbal cues of rage. So you see them. So note them. What do they look like? Do you hear it in a tone of voice? Do you see it in like a tight body? And you can just say, oh, like your body's so tense. Like, are you angry about something? And because she could just be like, no, I'm just really cold in this room. It's freezing in here. I don't, right? Like you can invite conversation about it as much as you want. It might not always work. But as long as you're the one who tries to stay calm, non-judgmental, remember this is their neurofeedback loop system, not yours. You're just noting that they look unsafe, they look unhappy, they look angry, and you're more just kind of inquiring, I see this. Am I accurate? Am I not? What's going on? Like, help me understand and see you better. Remember the saying that I love for communication, listen to understand, not to respond, right? So you can even also ask questions to understand. not to be responsive or to change their opinion or to influence them, not say, why are you so angry? Everything's fine. Right? You don't say that. You say, you look upset. Help me understand why. What's going on? So hopefully I've helped you with
I'm
that.
curious a lot.
Okay.
And that,
Help me understand.
yeah,
I say, I'm
yeah,
confused.
yes,
Help me
yes,
understand.
yes.
Like
And
6 times a day.
yeah, yeah. How she
As
responds.
you're saying that, the mom you're spinning, the cue I've used with my kids, and they've used it on me, and it's been quite effective. Is, can you say that in a nicer way?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I know what you're trying to say, but can you say it in a nicer way? And most of the time, I'm like, yeah, I absolutely could say that in a nicer way.
Yeah, yeah.
You are so right. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's just, it's an invitation to do things a little differently. Oh, yeah. And I think it helps it get it up here to go,
Yep.
oh, because I'm sure when I was spinning, everything was back here.
Right.
And it went up there and I went, oh, yeah, I am. And this is not productive. So,
Right. And what she's trying to say is that when you're in that reactionary state, you're in this back survival brain that I've talked about, that fight, flight, freeze, stress state. Usually it's in your executive functioning brain that, by the way, you have to be curious, you have to breathe, you have to allow time and blood flow to occur to be up here, to be like, oh yeah, these are my children. I love them. They are my treasures. I want to treat them with respect because I want them to expect other people to be, treat them with respect. Oh, let me adjust my my mentality and the way I'm speaking. So that just takes time. And if you can add curiosity to it and time and breathing and oxygen and blood flow, that helps.
So the next one, I'm the betraying partner, and I think I'm in Fawn quite a bit with my wife and with a lot of my mom growing up. My wife holds the upper hand in my perception because she is threatening to leave all the time due to my betrayal. That is my biggest fear. Any advice for me? Exercises I can practice.
So remember, the goal is not to subvert your feelings and experiences. It's hard because, again, you've not assessed if it's safe to do so, but you know it. You know the story you're telling yourself. So you need to start sharing that with her. So when you feel that moment, so get familiar with what it feels like in your neurobiology, when it feels like something's happening and you kind of freeze and you start wondering how to avoid the conflict or please her or de-escalate the anger. Pay attention to it so the cue can let you know, ooh, I'm in that state. You might want to, even when you're not in that state with her, share what you're going to be doing, which is like, hey, I've noticed I go into this please appease state. I'd like to not, because I'd like to be real, have real conversations with you, talk about hard things. But this is the fear that goes through my mind, which you're not alone. This is an extremely common thing that happens is, kind of once you've been discovered, all of a sudden that's when you guys start doing relationship dialysis, seeing what worked and what didn't work. How can we be better? How can I support you? How can I help you heal? But the betraying partner will often be in that fawn state of like, can I have opinions? Can I have feelings? What are my feelings? What are my opinions? And it kind of comes out in like either like explosions or not at all. So you can say it and like bring that inner monologue out and say, I'm going to try to share my feelings. I'm going to try to stay present with you. But I'm in so much fear about you leaving that it takes me a little bit extra time to like breathe and calm down and then show up. So I have another video that's called how trauma impacts your nervous system. And I talk about the polyvagal theory. And that might be really good to help you down escalate or kind of down regulate your really upregulated system, because fawning, pleasing and appeasing is still a sign that you are very overwhelmed, that your nervous system is overwhelmed. So you do need to engage down regulation skills of, deep breathing, counting back from 100 by 7. Try doing that. Stand on one foot, sigh. These are ways to calm down the system and say, you're safe. Right now, she's not packing her bags and leaving you. She's trying to understand why you missed that 12-step meeting last night that you were supposed to go to. So just breathe and have a difficult conversation around it. And Tammy
Go ahead.
beautifully explained all that stuff that needs to be unraveled. Like I said, the opposite of fawn response isn't just all of a sudden asserting yourself. It's definitely unraveling, the trauma history, the complex trauma, the shame voices of fears of abandonment and all that kind of stuff. So it's not just as simple as just asserting yourself. I wish it were that easy, but it's not.
So it's clear that it is important to develop boundaries to help offset the desire to fawn and thus be more authentic in the relationship. Do you have any recommendations for a resource to help identify and name my boundaries? This seems critical so I can communicate them and be more real in our relationship and express my needs versus fawning.
Yeah. Well, I have several the YouTube. So on my channel, Kristin Snowden, I have several previous webinars posted specifically on boundaries. I have I feel a really helpful, impactful boundaries chart. I think it's like the #1 most downloaded thing on my website. So I think it's really helpful to just review it every day and say, am I staying and behaving and making choices that keep me on the healthy boundaries side? Or am I kind of fawning or people pleasing and responding on the unhealthy boundaries side? I also do live small group workshops, which actually are starting, I think, next week. And we cover boundaries a lot because it's really important to identify them, identify values, goals, who you want to show up as, how you want to show up, along with exploring shame, trauma, the fears of vulnerability, etc. So those are helpful resources, but you guys probably have some too, Tammy.
Yeah, on our websites, but I would invite you, and Kristin just mentioned it, shame is not like if you fawn, identify it and go, I can do this differently, but it doesn't have to go, oh, I'm so shame filled, because that's counterproductive. So it's always looking at things and how can we step into it differently? How can we engage differently? But going to the shame spiral, doesn't help anyone. So next question. Fawn is my go-to response, and I believe its origin being my mother was so anxious that she could shut down at any point and not be able to function. Now, as a betrayer, I find it hard to be vulnerable and completely open with my wife on feelings and go into fawn mode. How can I tell when I am in fawn mode versus sincere desire to show up for my wife in her trauma? That's a great question. How to figure out,
and it's
because those are
obviously
nuances.
Resonated with a lot of people. Yeah. I can understand that. So you've probably seen my responses to previous questions because they're similar. I do, again, there's a lot of videos that I have on like shame and fears of vulnerability. So I'd encourage you to kind of look at those. That helps you really understand the levels of trauma and shame stories that you tell yourself that lead to that fawn response. The more you know, believe it or not, intimacy and having connections with your partner, showing up for your wife, is to even say, like, you're in a state of trauma and I don't know how to show up for you. Like, help me understand. I'm frozen, afraid that I'm going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. Do you need a hug? No, get away from me. Okay. Can I come back? When do you want me to come back? Come back in 3 hours. Okay. And then in those 3 hours, can we sit down for a cup of coffee? Can I take you out? You get to just let that inner monologue inside you out, and just say, like, help me understand, what do I do with my hands? Because fawn mode is, I didn't do anything with my hands. I did whatever you told me what to do. I don't even know, but it's like, I feel fear. I'm afraid I'm going to make the wrong response. So you understand now that that's the state that I'm in. I want to say this. I want to, share this with you. How can I do that and help you feel safe also? So yeah. And then obviously you're talking about what Tammy had mentioned about the story around mom and family history. That needs to be explored. right? Your fawn response worked for a while until it didn't, and you need to explore the story you were telling yourself, how you thought you were serving yourself and others by fawning, people pleasing, etc. How do you really want to show up? What is that answer? Do you want to show up as being understanding, validating, being a good listener, helping someone else feel safe, feel heard? You're going to have to explore that and find out what the answers to that are. Those aren't natural states. So, especially if you have addiction issues, they're multi layered. Sometimes you guys can do it in therapy with role playing, or just you alone with your therapist in role playing. You can process it with maybe sponsor in your community. It's going to take practice, and it's going to be an imperfect execution.
And you'll do it better with people that aren't like, it's why in treatment, like the guys can work on these skills with other addicts because there's less risk. Your most vulnerable relationship are the people that are closest to you. We have the most fear. We don't want to do it wrong. We don't know how to change those patterns. It's really easy to get into the same little loops repeated that don't serve either of us, but that we don't know any better. So sometimes it's practicing with, your peer group, with your recovery group, that may be how you start to develop better skills for it.
Yeah. Okay. Let me jump down really fast too. Someone's asking me, is the boundaries group just for women? No, when I do the Brene Brown, like Daring Greatly workshop, that's co-ed. When I do betrayed partner workshops, it's just female. It's just for women. So my Brene Brown, I call it courageous connection, daring greatly, rising strong, shame resiliency, boundary setting, understanding fear and vulnerability workshops. That is co-ed and small. It's not usually more than 7 people. I like to keep it really small.
And then the last question, I am the addict of 3 decades plus. Discovery a year ago. I am in 12-step, have a sponsor, attend a weekly group session. I assume that means with a therapist. I've just finished Sex, Porn Addiction 101, reading out of the doghouse. I think you get my drift. My wife and I still together, living together, taking, talking, etc. However, she's very often brings up past horrible decisions. Would you agree or disagree with the following statement? We need to stop focusing on the past and focus on today and our future.
So I'm glad you're reading out of the doghouse, because that's going to talk about the fact that there's a need. Oftentimes what's happening, to help you understand the betrayed partner, is now that she's kind of realized that you had all this double life, nefarious behavior going on in the backdrop, for her own safety, she's trying to reconcile that in her brain. How did she see this person, her partner, as this? And then he or she was off doing all this stuff in the background. So a lot of these questions are just her trying to make sense, trying to seek safety and better understand, how could you make all these bad choices? And why would I trust you to not do that stuff anymore? I mean, I know one of the steps you mentioned, you were doing all this stuff, discovery. So I don't know if there's been like a full therapeutic disclosure. But the quick answer is there's going to be quite a bit of focus on the past for quite some time, until there are signs that the ins and outs of how it happened, how to avoid it, what it was all about, all the feelings and the experiences and the trauma that you were kind of just piling on top of to avoid it, and that she feels like you have appropriately assessed everything and changed and have a great understanding of it. And she understands it, because a big safety thing for her is that she's going to know the cues. Wants to know everything, the ins and outs, so much that she's going to know the cues if and when you start engaging in these behaviors again. And I'm sure, Tammy, you have a lot to add about that.
Well, 3 decades. And you know what? I mean, that's the behavior. The wanting to dissociate, the maladaptive coping mechanisms probably started even younger than that. You've been doing this for a year. Great. And that sounds, I mean, I'm like, seriously, as a fellow recovering person, yay. but if you're doing the math, that's 1 year to 30 years, 1/30th. That's a very short amount of time. It takes partners, when you actually stop the behavior and are starting to do the right things, they're looking at, it's typically, 12 to 24 months before they start going, okay, now I see that this person is changing. It's what your actions are doing, and you're doing a lot of right things. So stay the course, keep doing it. But it would be really lovely if, as addicts, we could go, well, we're all done talking about the past and all of that rotten stuff, and now we're just going to focus on the future and Disney World. That isn't the reality. So part of doing the 12 steps, which because you're doing it, is we don't, part of the promise is we don't regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. So if you are doing the 12 steps and you've done your 4th and 5th step and you're working on things, you're going to, part of the promise is you're going to know a new happiness and a new freedom. And you won't, it won't always be all consuming, the past. And you can understand, hopefully, in your brain, they're bad decisions. They were fueled by addiction. They were fueled by lots of pain or needing to escape. You're looking to do it better. You showing up in a very different way. Reread Out of the Doghouse. We started an Out of the Doghouse work group. It's full. Right. We're going to start another one February 1st, and that will help you and support you. And hopefully, as Kristin said, if you haven't done a formal therapeutic disclosure, hopefully both of you are working with, professionals to be able to, have that on the plan as well. That'll help set the foundation, for your spouse to be able to, to believe that there's, truth and trustworthiness. So.
Yeah. And let me give a skill for the addicts really fast that might be helpful. Remember, I talked about we need to view, it's really helpful when you cannot personalize something coming at you from your betrayed partner, because they're dealing with so many different things right now, and just view them as a nervous system feedback loop system. So if she's coming at you with something in the past, something about poor decisions you made, how could you, just take it as a feedback loop system and say, it looks like you're feeling really unsafe. It looks like you're really struggling to see whether I'm changing or I'm making the progress. How can I help you feel safe again? So, right? Like, it's not, oh my God, how long are we going to have to relive the past? How many times am I going to have my bad choices rubbed in my face? Just view her as a nervous system feedback loop. And her body language and her stories are showing you that she is not feeling safe. And you step back and you help her get curious and you engage her and say, you sound really upset. You sound like understandably angry and scared. What can I do right now to help you? Well, I just want to make sure you're going to your meetings. Oh, well, I just want to make sure that, that's the way you engage them, right? So she's talking about the past, but you can engage her in the present, in this moment, to help her feel more safe. That's huge for the healing process.
Yes. And it takes it away from, oh, she's attacking me and throwing this up again. You are engaging her in a very different way. That was great. Thank you for sharing that, Kristin. So thank you all for joining us. Join us. So next week is Eddie Caparucci. But Kristin will be back in February. So second week of the month, Kristin will be back. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And make sure to just check out my website, join my mailing list if you want. And I do have some spaces open for those live workshops that are starting next week if you're interested.
Great. I share them with so many people. So yeah, I'm definitely pointing people towards your work.
Great.
Take care.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Happy New Year.